Hello everyone, it's Mark Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore, and welcome to the Music Masterclass. This is my series where we talk about some aspect of making music, the creative act of making music, composing, arranging, improvising, playing by ear, anything that involves your own creativity in making music. And as we've been doing lately, we're going to be looking at the material we've been covering in the harmony course. And specifically what we've been looking at in the harmony course has been, it's kind of wrapping up the discussions that we've had thus far. I'm just kind of finessing my window layout, don't mind me. But it's kind of wrapping up all the things that we've talked about so far as how chords can fit together individually. So if I were to make an analogy, so the subject in general is what I refer to as idioms. And these are combinations of chords that are known to work well together that are maybe more than just two chords. Because so much of what we study about harmony has to do with one chord at a time and where it's going. And that's all good. That is wonderful to know. And this is how we're going to build a lot of creative structures and connecting material and so forth. But the reality is a large part of a lot of music is using some fairly common structures of like 4 or 5 chords in a row that serve a particular purpose. And so I sometimes use the analogy of construction. I think about like building a house. If you wanted to build a house, I could give you a pile of lumber, a few boxes of nails, and a hammer and a saw and say, go for it. And you'd have to build the whole thing yourself. But reality is that's not how houses are built, right? I mean, windows are ready-made units. You buy a window and you plug it into your house. And yes, you have a choice of styles and you can rip them out. Same with door frames, lots of things in building of houses, roof trusses and so forth. I don't actually know about building houses, but I know a tiny bit. So the idea that there's going to be certain things that are ready to use and we can use them. And so this is kind of what we're studying in this section of the course. And so what I'm going to do is go ahead and flip over to where I have people's versions of things here, and I'm going to play through them. And I'm going to play through first. Let me get this window shrunk down so I can continue to see the chat. And so this is Kevin McDonald's version, and it's so the piece we're working on here is London Bridge. Very simple little song, and I chose it because it's simple, and it also happens to have exactly the same phrase structure as Mary Had a Little Lamb, which is the piece I used in my demonstration. And when I talk about phrase structure, what I mean are these identifications that I made of which phrases are what I call pre-cadences versus cadences versus static progressions. And so this is all the stuff that's detailed in the course. And so those of you who are in the course, you have an idea of what we're talking about. If this is new, well, that's just try to follow along. But a cadence, I think, maybe most people have a sense of what that means. It's a chord progression that brings you back to 1. Usually maybe starting on 2 or some sort of substitute. A pre-cadence is going to be something that gets you to a cadence. And a static progression is something that just kind of hangs out on the 1 chord. So I'm going to play through and I gave you a whole list of different pre-cadences, a whole list of cadences, a whole list of static progressions that are all commonly used. It's not the only ones that exist in the world, but they're common. And then the goal in this project was then to run through the list and try them all out, see which ones you liked, and then assemble a harmonization just based on gluing those things together. And people came up with some really nice results. And so this is Kevin McDonald's version. I will just play it on the piano so I can give it reasonable voicings. So lots of interesting stuff going on in this one. And so this first progression, we have this chromatically descending series of dominants. This is a really nice progression that works in a lot of situations, and it works interestingly in this case because you end up with non-chord tones here, but that's not a bad sound for considering this B7 is meant to tonicize an E minor chord. We would assume an E minor chord was coming next. That G is diatonic in the key of E minor. So that note would be fine. The F is at least a whole step above a chord tone, so it's an interesting dissonance. And then we would expect it to go to E. So, but it doesn't, because there's been a tritone substitution made, or you can see this as an augmented sixth chord. But the beauty of thinking about these idioms is you don't have to analyze it at that level. You just have to know that that's something that's on the list. And yes, you want to understand where these things come from, so you're not just plugging in things with no idea why they work. And that's what we've already covered in the course. But now we get to have fun with them. So this makes it a French augmented sixth for what it's worth. And then he chose to, instead of picking a cadence that starts with D minor, he chose one starting with A flat 7, which is again on the list. It's another augmented sixth chord. And he chose it because it continues that chromatic descent, which is really nice. That's really nice. So assuming that you can handle that little bit of dissonance there, this is a beautiful version of this progression. And then this progression just 1 and back to 5. Now this next progression he has some interesting elements to it. It's moving fast, right? Because I'm talking about making a static progression, one that starts with 1 and leads back to 1. And I'm talking about doing that for just one measure. So the next phrase can be a one measure precadence. In doing that, you end up with a faster harmonic rhythm than we've had. We have chords that change every beat. And so you have to be okay with that change in the harmonic rhythm to have any chance of accepting this in your ears. And as long as it's all, handled appropriately and how you do the accompaniment, it should be okay. So if I look at that, so far, so good. I look at that G here in the melody. It's a non-chord tone, but it's resolving down by step. So that's fine. Whoops. Right, that would be totally fine. Now this, the F sharp diminished chord with an F in the melody. Now this is pretty crunchy, right? So this is one of those things, that's the term I use for those who haven't heard it, for a dissonance that's not an absolute no, but is a eyebrow raiser. It's a diminished 7th chord, and the melody note is a whole step above a chord tone. It's quite crunchy. So you have to be okay with that also to accept this progression. And a lot of that is going to depend on tempo. It's going to depend on how you voice the chords underneath it. I could play around with different voicings to see if I like it better voiced differently or anything. If I'm trying to ascertain in my own mind if I'm okay with that. But those are the questions you ask. When you're using these idioms, it's there. Harmonically it works. Your only question is, how well does it fit the melody? And so for me, I look at that one and go, well, that's a little iffy, but it could be okay. Now, for the precadence here, he has this. The one on the list is just C to C sharp diminished. And so what's happened here is he went ahead and included the C with the G in the bass to complete that static progression, which is absolutely what you want to do. If you've just played this bass line, that diminished chord wants to go to a G, right? And so at this point, jumping from here to the C sharp diminished feels a little feels maybe a little sudden. And so that's another thing you'd have to be okay with. There's no rule that says you have to approach a diminished chord by step. They usually resolve by step, and there's almost always a way to respell it so that it resolves by step or via common tone. But the approach can be by leap like it is here. The root is by step, but the bass is leaping. So then the question is, well, could you maybe put that diminished chord in an inversion and have a smaller leap and be happier with it? Or I think I suggested in the comments, just go ahead and using the 6th chord here, 1 to 6, and then we get an ascending bass line that kind of mirrors the descending bass line we had before. So assuming that we're okay with that idiom here, I think it's a really interesting choice that Kevin made here for that measure. Assuming that you're okay with that, I probably would have chosen an A7 here to continue that motion and avoid the leap into the diminished chord. But then jazz there, right? Having this tritone substitution, flat 2 chord going to 1, right? So that's how we're going to be looking at this. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to look at some other people's and kind of go through a similar sort of thing. I won't have to explain as much what I'm doing now that we have a context for it. We're just going to evaluate how well it worked or didn't work. But I also want to try a few ear exercises here if we can, where I play you some of the idioms and you try to figure out which one they are, and I'll put some up on the screen for you to look at and ask you which one I'm playing. But first, I want to run through some of the other ones that were posted and give some comments on this one. So, Bruce, I see that you have done a different song, so I'm going to look at this maybe later but I will address your one question here about the line with the hook pointing down. The way you change the hook direction for a line is after adding the line. If I go to the palettes, well, I don't know if you're watching, but if you are, let's say that I've added a line here, or like this one here. You can click this guy here and then come to the properties panel. Oh, is that not? Under the properties panel, you will see the hook height, and you just want to make that be a negative number. And now it will point upwards. So negative numbers for the height of that hook point up. That is how that works. So in any case, I will look at that later, since it's a different piece. But it is a nice piece for this purpose. I've done harmonizations of this piece before for various reasons. And one nice thing about this piece is it does have a different phrase structure to it, so we'll be looking at different things when I do take a look at that one. But meanwhile, I'm going to go on to Glenn's here, and Glenn's I've only taken a quick look at, but it's really nice as well, and it lets me talk about one thing that also happened in Lonnie's version, but I'll talk about it with respect to Glenn's. So here's Glenn's version. Let me see if I can zoom a little more. Can I get it to the point where I can actually see? Yeah, there we go. I can see everything all at once. Oops, I can't see the cadence chords. So, really nice things you've done here, Glenn. I think you did a great job with this in several different ways. So first of all, this one here, this 1, 4, 3, 6 that he's used here, it puts, in this case, the 9th, a non-chord tone in the melody, but it resolves nicely by step. Chord tone, passing tone, chord tone, right? This, if you can use 1, 4, 3, 6, do it. And I don't mean that's your only choice, but 1, 4, 3, 6 is, and dominant 6 in particular, this is like the precadence, kind of like if you look up precadence in the dictionary, that would be the picture they show. Not that I just made up that word, by the way. Precadence is not a standard musical term, but something that comes before a cadence. What else are you going to call it? And I'm going to tell you this story, which some of you have heard before, but that's okay. This chord progression was the key to me developing this whole way of looking at things in terms of idioms. And it came about because I was watching a concert, and I was listening to a concert. I was at a concert with some musicians, Ron Miles, Eric Gunnison, and Paul Warburton. There was probably a drummer, but I can't remember who it was. Paul Warburton was the bassist, and this was a jazz group, and they were playing jazz standards. They weren't doing like a lot of complicated original music. They were playing standard kind of music, Gershwin, Cole Porter, etc. And I knew a lot of the songs they were playing, but I could tell they were using different chords than I was used to. And yet they didn't sound like crazy, weirdly reharmonized. They just sounded different. And I noticed, and this happens often, right? It happens often in a jazz context. People will come up with their own harmonizations. But what I started to notice was Paul Warburton on the bass. Every time we'd come to some particular phrase in a song, I would hear that line. Boom, 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 boom. And I would hear him playing that line, just, strongly plucking out the roots of those chords. And he has a low C string, or had a low C string on his bass. Boom, boom, boom. And so those notes would just power through the ensemble. And I got really used to hearing that 1-4-3-6 progression. It became like a little melody that my ears zeroed in on. And I was thinking, as I'm listening, that's not the chord progression that I know for this song. Like I think when I hear this song, I usually just hear it go C to A7. I don't hear those other chords. Or I hear a C and then a C sharp diminished, or I hear, some other combination of notes. And it was Paul Warburton, through playing that bass line so insistently, that I became aware, well, gee, that 1-4-3-6, I can kind of plug that in a lot of places that I didn't know. I mean, I certainly had seen that chord progression before, but I had never thought of just plugging that whole chord progression in place of another one. And so that was the start of my thinking along these lines of these chord progressions playing a role, and then being able to interchange chord progressions within that role. So in any case, really nice. This cadence, he's using that same one that Kevin MacDonald used in the second phrase, in the second line of the tune, but Glenn here is using it on the first one. Now, the next thing that happened, this then is, so that phrase here, there's something going on here, and Lonnie, you did this as well, and I commented about it. Excuse me. I wrote in a static progression here, followed by another static progression on the next line. And the thing is that you can totally do that. Okay, so what's happening here is both Glenn and Lonnie basically treated those two bars as one long static progression rather than two separate ones, which is what I actually meant. And that's kind of why I put the lines with the ending arrows so you could tell where they were, and why I chose one that exactly matched my demo so that you could follow things the way it was in the demo. But it's absolutely valid to take two short static progressions and treat them as one long one, or vice versa. It gives you different ways of playing with harmony. You either choose to return to one in the middle of the thing, or you choose not to. And when we look at Lonnie's, you'll see that she did something that made a really interesting thing happen. In Glenn's version, the chord progression he used, that's a totally diatonic one. It ends up with a 3 chord here, at the beginning of the next phrase, which is a substitute for one. So he actually is kind of returning to a tonic at the beginning of bar 5 with his version. In Lonnie's version, I don't remember. Oh, shoot. I must have just closed a tab accidentally. I'm not sure which of these two tabs is which, but unfortunately, hers is the one I just closed. Her version actually ended up with not a tonic chord there at the beginning of that second bar. Have to wait for this to load again. Meanwhile, let me go back to this version. So in this version, we have bar 5 still starting with a tonic type of chord. It's 3 instead of 1, but it's still basically tonic family chord. And so this progression doesn't feel that different from where we might have started from in a harmonization. Lonnie's version ends up sounding very different because her static progression is this one here, which would be fine as a 2-measure static progression. 1, sharp 1 diminished, 2, 5. That's absolutely on our list of static progressions. But what it did is it ended up replacing what was a tonic chord at the beginning of bar 5, and now it's a 2 chord. That's fine. And this is one of the reasons why sometimes it's fun to take 2 static progressions and look at them as one big one, or vice versa, because it sometimes allows you to put a dominant chord or a subdominant chord where a tonic one was and have it work. So it's great that this actually worked with the melody there. Right? That works just fine. It's really nice. This is a non-chord tone resolving up to a chord tone and then coming down by step. It's doing all the things that you would need the melody to do over those chords. It's just really interesting because it has now totally changed the nature of that measure. So I love it when things like that happen. When looking at one of these things in 2 different ways gives you a different way of my screen still looks good. Could just be on your end. I don't know, Dave. But thanks for checking in at least so that I know that I'm live at all. Anyhow, so I love it when things like that happen, and they happen if you make them happen. Choosing to look at some phrase, either zooming in or zooming out to see a 2-bar phrase instead of 2 1-bar phrases, or a 4-bar phrase instead of 2 2-bar phrases, right? You can get lots of different interesting results when it happens to work out. So anyhow, I love it that it worked out that way. Oh crap, what just happened? Oh, I know, I just clicked there. Yeah, it goes fuzzy very briefly when I switched windows, so maybe that's all it was that you saw, just a brief fuzz of Chrome swapping in tabs. In any case, the comment that I would make, though, is so that general idea of choosing to see 2 static progressions in a row as one big one, absolutely do that when you can, if to give you more options. But normally, I wouldn't do it across major phrase boundaries, right? I'm talking about 2-bar phrases and 1-bar phrases here, but if I stand back further, this is one long 4-bar phrase. It does feel a little weird to have that 2-bar phrase straddle that 4-bar boundary. It's nothing, the chords work, so I'm actually quite happy with how it worked out, but in general, I wouldn't be doing that. I wouldn't be having a single harmonic idiom try to stretch from bar 4 to bar 5 of a phrase, basically, or between bar 8 and bar 9. I wouldn't try to take a 2-bar phrase and make it straddle a 4-bar boundary. It would either normally sit squarely in the first 2 bars or the second 2 bars of a 4-bar phrase, normally. But you can't argue when it works. So, nice. And then going on with Lonnie's then, she uses that diminished chord again. So she used it once here. now she also uses that tritone substitution there. So I'm going to talk about that ending in a second. So the other thing that she did, which was nice, so she has not 1 4 3 6, but just the simpler 1 3 6 3 6, and then she does this nice minor plagal cadence. Minor 4 to flat 7 coming back. I love it. Sounds great. I might have, if I were to do that, I might have gone ahead and let that A7 resolve to D minor. Or let it go to to F minor there. So the comment that I will make about this, and I did add it in a comment in the post about this project. If you use a cadence that starts with 4, you do want to think a little bit about your lead into it and think about whether you really want to have an A7 at the end of the pre-cadence if you're trying to reach a 4 chord. In other words, don't assume that 6 chord at the end of the pre-cadence that was designed to lead to 2, don't assume it's going to sound good going to 4. It might, or it might not. Let's hear it again. So the jump from A7 to F minor, I mean, yes, you can explain it and say, oh, it's a deceptive resolution or whatever, and then that's fine. But I would just say don't assume it's going to sound good. If you're going to use a cadence that starts with a 4 chord, I would recommend normally replacing that 6 chord at the end of the pre-cadence with a secondary dominant to get you to the 4. So I might put in a C7 at the end of that measure. So that I get C7 to F minor. I didn't actually like how it sounds, so I may or may not do that. But those are the things I would think about. So if you choose to use a cadence that starts on 4, you might need to not use one of these stock pre-cadences that's designed to get you to 2, because you might not like how they fit together. That's my comment about that. And I don't dislike how it worked out in this case, but it's just something to think about. All right, so the next thing that I want to talk about that's pretty relevant to a lot of people's here has to do with the end. And this is my bad, because I didn't really talk about the end in my demonstration. But when I identify the last phrase as static, a lot of people did some version of what Lonnie did here of trying to have a phrase that starts on 1 and then leads you back to 1 so it can close with a 1 chord. But that's not actually what I meant. The static progressions that I'm normally talking about, like let me flip over to the first one I looked at, Kevin's. The static progression here is just C to G, and it's designed to come back to C. The C that it comes back to is in the start of the next phrase. The static progression doesn't include its own final 1 chord. It's designed to lead to a 1 chord in the next phrase. So my and then the next one here, and I keep forgetting. Okay, yeah, this is Glenn's. He kind of chose to sidestep the issue by not really leaving a C chord. He has a C chord and then a C with a G in the bass. So it stays on a C chord, and yet it moves, and then we could say, yes, it's designed to come back to C. But normally, at the end of a short tune like this, I expect that final static progression, because it's almost always going to be a final static progression, because the song's going to end on a 1 chord, and then is what we call a turnaround, something designed to get us back to the beginning for the next verse. Because in these simple short tunes like this, the tune's not over after 8 bars. You're going to sing it again, or maybe you will, maybe you won't. But a lot of these tunes are designed to have multiple verses. And so what we expect, or if it's in a jazz context, you're going to solo over that chord progression. So what I expect out of this static progression is not for the final 1 chord to actually appear within that measure, but to see just and then that's the end, so that we're ready to come back to C at the beginning of the next phrase. So I would have expected this to go more like, and then come back to the C to start the next phrase. I might have waited to play the A flat until beat 3 in that case. And yes, the G7 is going to clash with the C in the melody, and that's going to happen every single time, right? Almost every single song is going to end with a tonic, and you're going to want a 5 chord at the end of your turnaround to get back to the beginning, and you're going to have to worry about that tonic note clashing with the 5 chord, and you're just going to have to live with it. You're either going to say, well, let's just take a breath at the end of that note, not hold it for its full duration, or you can voice that as G7 sus to make it be okay. Either of those will be okay. So in any case, at the end of the tune there, that's normally what we expect is what we call a turnaround. Those final chords are often put in parentheses to indicate that you only play them when going back to the beginning. And I glossed over that or basically didn't talk about it at all. So my bad, but that's what I expect here. Now, to finally end the tune, there's all these common idioms using for ends, going back to right. That's like the cliche Haydn Mozart ending of the early classical era. And then in jazz, we have all these other kind of cliche endings. And so, yeah, you can make a whole study out of idioms that are used to finally end a piece. And usually they're going to be longer than just that one bar. Okay, so I am going to go on. So yeah, I just want to finish going through Glenn's version here. So I'll start at the second phrase. Now I love how that worked. And then he's got a 2/5. So this phrase here works great with the melody, right? Those chords work fantastically. This B flat 7 tritone substitution, or augmented 6th chord helping to tonicize the D minor coming up. The only thing about this is this diatonic static progression, 1, 2, 3, 2, is really designed to come back to 1. So I would let it come back to 1. 1 flat 7 6 would be lovely also. Just 1 flat 7 6. So I would probably have used the C chord instead of the E minor 7, since we just had the E minor 7, and that diatonic static progression is really designed to go up and come down like that. That's kind of what gives it its thing, because it's otherwise not the most interesting progression in the world. It's totally diatonic. It has no circle of fifths motion in it. So it's not a strong static progression on its own. It just sometimes fits things perfectly, but you probably do want to let it go to that final C. All right, so I'm going to move on next to Kevin Johnson's, which I've only briefly looked at. And I see that you've written in some voicings here that are, so I'm gonna go ahead and let MuseScore play your version, Kevin. I'm wondering about these voicings here because they are pretty darn low, right? I mean, yes, you've got a bass down here, but this is awfully low for me to be hearing non-roots in the piano. So I'm thinking what I'm going to hear is going to be on the muddy side, and if so, I might play it differently. But let's go ahead and hear what you wrote here. Make sure my volume's at a reasonable level. All right. I'm smiling because I like it a lot. It is, maybe, could you hear what, I mean, coming through the internet, I'm not sure what everyone hears, but this, if I try to literally play this and play the bass note on it too. Right, this is I'm hearing this F is an octave lower. That A is pretty low, and then right, we're hearing a lot of pretty low notes. Normally, I talk about C level, and sometimes I'll talk about middle C being our C level, and we try to keep most of our chord voicing, if we're playing a close position voicing, somewhere around middle C. But there's also the C below middle C, and this is the point at which I don't want to hear things other than bass notes. I don't want to hear thirds. I don't, unless it's the bass note. If you're putting an actual inversion on the chord, then yeah, you can put a third down there. But generally speaking, I just want to hear roots below here or fifths. Sometimes you can play fifths pretty low, and this has to do with the overtone series. And you get kind of muddy sounds when you try to play a third too low. And, you know, we can quibble about what's too low. But if you're listening to this and thinking it's sounding muddy, I would say, yes, it does sound a little muddy and could be improved by tweaking that a little bit. So what does he have going here? Well, he has that same 1, 4, 3, 6. 4, 3, 6. Yeah. And now he's also resolving that to F. So that 6 is going to 4 instead of to 2, which is fine. But had he gone to 2, and then I probably would have done it that way, just to let that secondary dominant do its thing. The deceptive resolution is fine too. Oops. F minor. And then he's using that diatonic one. Right? So he's using that 1, 2, 3, 2 version, but he's doing it within the one measure as I originally intended it to be. And that's what that one sounds like. And it works. This next measure, he's doing something that you can definitely do. Now, the actual one on the list is A flat 7, not A flat major 7, right? And that's because A flat 7 to G would have been an augmented 6th chord. That would be the the melody had been, if it had been something like that, this would have been, well, the way I've got it voiced right now, an Italian augmented 6th. So that, as an augmented 6th chord, is where that idiom came from and why it made the list. Now, voicing it as a major 7th chord, which you kind of have to do because the G would clash with the F sharp. If we wanted to make that A flat 7, or spelling it as an actual augmented 6th, calling it F sharp, that clash would be pretty harsh. And so I think Kevin was absolutely right. I think Kevin was absolutely right to want to make it A flat major 7. And then the question is, well, how okay is that? And by the way, Dave, I would love it if other people chime in and let us know. I keep looking over every once in a while at my other screen here, and it's fine here on my other screen, which has to go through the internet and come back. So I think what I'm putting out to the internet is fine, meaning the recording should be fine. That's my guess, but I would love it if other people can confirm or deny what you see. In any case, the question is, now that we've changed the quality of the chord, we can no longer explain it as a augmented 6th chord or tritone substitution for 2. But can we explain it at all? And yes, we can. It's a borrowed chord, right? The key of C minor would have that flat 6 chord. So we could say it's a borrowed chord, flat 6, going to 5. Now, the question is, do we like it as much? I don't know. That's everyone gets to make that call for themselves. I have definitely done that. I've definitely made that call before when I thought, oh man, I really want the sound of that flat 6, but the melody is clashing, and so I can't make it a dominant 7th chord. Major 7th is making it okay for me. I have absolutely done that before. Yeah, you just get to everyone gets to make your own calls. And that's the interesting thing here is, even though we're working, I talked about prefabricated windows, and you might think, oh, we're going to get cookie cutter houses and they're all going to look the same. But think about it here. We've just looked at 4 different versions of this, and everyone's is different, right? there's some points of similarity, but of course they are. We're talking about a piece in the key of C, and it's the same melody. You're going to see some similarities, but even drawing from the same idioms, we've got huge variety in what's happening here. So anyhow, that sound there is fine, and this one, obviously 1 to 6 is fine, and then here I would say don't be afraid of that A flat 7. I mean, I think you're making it only a half a beat because you're hedging on whether you like it or not. No, I say embrace that guy. Let it be a whole beat. Or, for that matter, let it take over both beats. Check that out. And here he's done a quick 1-4-1, which does feel like it's tied a bow on it. It's a static progression. He's gone ahead and let it come back to the C in the same measure. And as an ending for the whole tune, that's fine. If you wanted it to be a turnaround, you would make that F be 2 beats so that you could then get back to the C at the beginning of the next phrase. So, yeah, this is, again, a different harmonization. Lonnie had that B flat 7, but she had a different beginning of that measure. She didn't have this 1, 2, 3, 2 there. She didn't have a 4 chord there. So, you might see certain chords that multiple people are using in the same place, but you look at the whole piece and everyone is coming up with different harmonizations, which is exactly my evil plan here. All right, Jimmy's version next. For Jimmy's, I will play the chords because that's how I'm going to do it. He has a different version of the first progression, which I love, and he's explicitly written in some major sevenths, so I'm going to go ahead and honor those. I'm not sure which you meant here, but I'm going to go with that one. All right, so there's some really nice stuff happening here, and I see that you've listed tons of alternatives that you could have used instead, which is great. In fact, I'm going to show you something right now. Those of you who watched my video that I had in the newsletter where I taught myself in the bleak midwinter, and just sort of worked through memorizing the tune, transposing, and everything. Yesterday, I spent some time working on harmonizing it, and this is what I have to show for it. I basically say, first 2 bars, here are all the different harmonizations. Next 2 bars, that. The other, 2 more bars here. Here's 2 more bars. Here's 2 more bars. So I've got like half a dozen or more harmonizations of each 2-bar phrase. Some of them are just standard idioms, but some of them are ones that I tweaked specifically to fit the melody. And so at some point, I will be building an arrangement of the song built from that and make a video about that. So that's something to look forward to. So anyhow, I love that you were very exhaustive in listing these alternatives here, Jimmy. So he's also using what starts off looking like it's going to be the 1, 4, 3, 6, but he doesn't. He's using one that uses the B flat 7 here, which is also, remember, the first one we looked at, Kevin McDonald's, had that going on, right? They both have that B flat to A in it, but this one has a different chord in here. And this is yeah, that's something that happens. These idioms will have certain chords in common, certain chords not. And so here I want to take a step back. I know I'm just talking really fast and spitting out tons of information, and this will be a video that some people will probably want to watch many times to try to really absorb. But let me make a big picture observation here. So I'm slowing down to make it stand out. If there's anything that you take away from all of this that's not details, that's like concept, broad concept, here is the broad concept. Some chords are more important than others. This stuff that happens in the middle of phrases, That's not what the song is about. The song is about what happens at these mileposts, typically the downbeat of bars 1, 3, 5, and 7, depending on the harmonic rhythm of the tune. Sometimes it's every downbeat, sometimes it's only every 4 bars, but whatever. Certain chords are places where you either don't mess with them at all, or you only make simple changes to them, like changing 1 to 3 or changing 2 to 4. And then once you make that change, you build everything else around it. So certain chords are like the milepost chords, and that's why I so often have people start with a basic 1-4-5 harmonization to establish where those mileposts are. What we're now talking about are different paths from one milepost to the next. Routing is the term that Eric Gunnison, who's the person who was the pianist on that gig I mentioned, where I first, like, the light bulb went off about 1-4-3-6. So Eric Gunnison, great pianist. Routing is his term for these things that I'm calling idioms, different routings to get you from 1 to 2 and so forth. So he'll use the term routing for that. He's also the person, by the way, who Larry Hankins, I know, mentioned in comment on one of the lessons, said, wow, this is a really great concept. Once you learn this, you can go on and have your fame and fortune as a jazz pianist. And Eric's comment about fame and fortune as a jazz pianist is this. He says, oh yeah, if you get good enough, you can make tens of dollars. That's unfortunately the reality of life as a jazz musician. Okay, so anyhow, Jimmy has got that really nice phrase there. And then his cadence, 4 to minor 4, no complaints. This static regression he has here, I'm not sure where this one came from. This wasn't something from my list. So Jimmy, you might want to explain where 1, 4, 3 kind of came from, because that's not something I specifically listed. It works, right? They're all diatonic chords. No argument with those possible chords. But one thing about that E minor 7 is it doesn't pull me back to the C major 7. If, on the other hand, there had also been a D minor in there, 1, 4, 3, 2, 1, then I would have that 4, 3, 2, 1 stepwise motion into the C. Stepwise isn't necessarily as powerful as circle of fifths as far as roots go, but it's definitely a thing, which is why that is a thing. So this 1, 4, 3, 2, 1 is just a variation on 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, in which that second chord is a 4 instead of a 2. So again, this feels like you maybe thought through something as opposed to just plugged something in. Either that or there's a typo here, and but I don't know which. In any case, then he's chosen to use that same chord progression again in the next phrase. Whoops. Right, the same. So here, instead of having the short static and short precadence that I had done in my demo, I had mentioned you could treat the whole thing as one big precadence. A reason to do that would be to reuse the same chord progression, of course. But, you know, another thing you could do is choose, hey, what would happen if I picked a different precadence than I had before? And, you know, one of the ones like the descending one, which Kevin MacDonald very appropriately pointed out. There's something appropriate about using this descending chord progression in a song about a bridge falling down. I absolutely love that. That word painting, sometimes it's called, where you literally put in something in the melody or in the chords or in the music that's designed to mimic something about the lyrics. That is absolutely a thing, and it's clever. Some people say, "Oh, too clever! Don't do that." It's like it's I don't know. I like it personally. And then he's got the minor 4 to flat 7 here. I will say that flat 7 normally doesn't take a flat 9. Usually when we use a flat 7 chord, we don't put a flat 9 on it. And I can't say why, because it logically should make sense. It would resolve nicely back to the tonic. There's something about it that just isn't usually done, but I can't give you a good reason, and I can't tell you it doesn't sound fine here. So I'll just leave it at that. It's not usually done. Instead, it's that sharp 11, which, kind of comes from the French augmented sixth kind of sound, even though that's not how it's functioning here. And then again here, I'm not really sure this 4-1 static progression. That's not something that was on the list, because a static progression would normally start on 1, leave, and then come back. So I'm not sure where that one came from exactly, but that's fine. So that goes through the submissions that I've seen. And in the time that's left, I want to do this thing that I said I was going to do. If people are here and the screen and the sound is working okay, then great. And if not, then you can just play with this on your own. But what I'm going to do is find my list of idioms. Here's some cadences, and I'm going to put up a list here. Let's see. I'm going to put up, okay, since the first phrase was a precadence, I'm going to start with that. And I'm going to pick one of these 4 that you see on screen right now. One of these 4 is going to be what I'm going to play. And your task is to tell me 1, 2, 3, or 4. Which did I play? That is the task here. So let's get this zoomed appropriately where you can see the 4 that I mean. Can I zoom in more and still have it work? Just a little less, All right, here we go. I'm going to play one of these 4. It's either 1, 3, 6, or 1, 4, 3, 6, or 1, 4, flat 7, 6, or 1, 7, flat 7, 6. I think you're going to find it's really easy to say which is which. So, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Which did I play? Don't look at my hands, but whatever. I could try to cover them, but, whatever. It doesn't matter. Just listen and see if you can tell by listening. Which one was that? So we got a couple 1s already. And yes, of course, this was 1 because I didn't change in the first measure. So in a sense, that one you can kind of get a sense of just by the harmonic rhythm. But the next 3 are more similar. The next 3 have several chords. First of all, they start with a 1 chord and they all end with a 6 chord, but there's just different stuff going on in between. So the thing that's going on different here is chords 2 or 3, the second or third chords. So again, I'm going to play one of these 4. It's not going to be 1. It's going to be either 2, 3, or 4. And I want you to tell me which one it is. One, 2, 3, or 4. And I will play that one again. Ideally, do it without looking at my hands. Try to hear the sound. And then we'll talk about what you're listening for. One more. All right, we've got a couple 3s in, and that is absolutely the right answer. So there's a couple of things that I would have clued in on to tell me that. One is that hopefully that third chord, should stand out a little bit as not diatonic. I want your ears to get accustomed to what diatonic chords sound like versus what non-diatonic chords sound like. And that is why when I talked about that big picture harmonic analysis, I wanted you to focus on the non-diatonic chords, because that is where the interest is, and that's what our ears are going to pick up on in sorting this stuff out. So for me, if I was listening to that, I would have keyed in, oh, non-diatonic chord there, and then kind of reconstructed the rest of the chord progression from there. You don't have to have perfect pitch to figure this out. You have to be able to recognize patterns. And by giving you, say, a dozen different pre-cadences to learn, well, you can learn to recognize them. So as soon as you hear that one, you might say, oh, it's either this one or that one, because I recognize it was either this one with the F, or it was this one. Yes, and Beatrice, you're absolutely right. You heard the B flat 7. And so your guess, which wasn't correct, had that going on. And so you heard that and you were able to narrow it down from there. And then is when you have to then sort out, okay, then what was that second chord? Did it feel like... There's where I mentioned Paul Warburton on bass. Let me play that again. I'm hammering that bass note, right? And that's kind of how Paul plays, just powerful, right? It's hard to recognize the 4. What you can do is recognize it's not the 7. That chromatic descent would be the thing you would recognize. And then if you don't hear the chromatic descent, process of elimination, oh, it's probably 4. Now, how would you know it's 4 and not some other random chord? Well, part of it comes from, again, recognizing that these are common idioms, and 4 is the common chord that happens there. So knowing what to expect helps a lot. And then if you hear something else like, wow, that didn't sound like one of the common idioms, then maybe it's not the 4. But if it sounds familiar and it's not the 7, well, then it's got to be the 4. And so here I have to tell another silly story. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the TV show called The Big Bang Theory, right? It was a big American hit 10 years ago. I don't know how long ago. I didn't watch it back then, but I've been watching it in syndication now. And I know my dad was really into it. There's one episode in which that I just saw the other night that I've seen before, in which these two people are trying to solve, Sheldon and what's the girl's name? Penny. So for people who know the show, are trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle that's part of a scavenger hunt. And the idea is the jigsaw puzzle is going to give them the clue to where the next thing happens. And as they're putting it together, they get about a quarter of the way through, and Penny's like, it's the comic book store. And she recognized it just from just enough detail to be able to say, it's the comic book store. Sheldon, on the other hand, is like, I don't know, we got to finish putting this puzzle together. And so he takes his time finishing, and Penny's like, it's the comic book store, it's the comic book store, let's go, it's the comic book store. Because it's a race against other people, and she's wanting to get to that comic book store. And because she was able to recognize it just from limited context, because she was able to fill in the details in her mind, and Sheldon wasn't able to do that. So I'm asking you to be a Penny. Don't be a Sheldon. You don't need every detail. If you're able to pick out the signpost, you can fill in the rest. But yeah, you just have to keep filling in the details until you know enough, right? So that's the deal. All right, I'm going to do the same now with a static progression, and then we're going to wrap up here. So we're just going to look at these 4 static progressions here. 1 diatonic minor 6 2 5, or 1 dominant 6 2 5, or 1 sharp 1 diminished 2 5, or 1 sharp 2 diminished 2 5. All right, I'm going to play a melody, and you're going to tell me which of those 4 it is. It's obviously not London Bridge. So 1, 2, 3, or 4. And we've got a couple 4s in here, and that's absolutely correct. This is one where if you're doing this sort of process of elimination, hopefully you hear that that second chord was diminished. And then that narrows out the first 2. And then it's just whether it was the sharp 1 diminished or whether it was the sharp to diminished. And part of your clue to that could be hearing the bass note. Part of it could be thinking about the melody note and how it relates to that. How you sort that out. This is stuff you learn through experience, but it's being able to focus on what you want to focus on. That's kind of the point of all of this. Anyhow, we went through a ton of stuff today, and I hope you enjoyed the ride. So that said, let's thank everyone for being here. Thanks for your submissions. You all did a great job of going through all those samples and finding interesting chord progressions. And you vindicated my guess that no one was going to come up with exactly the same chord progression, because the odds of it are just really low when you have that many options. You got like a dozen different options for each 2-bar phrase. You're not going to come up with the same answers. And they're all interesting, and they all allow you to create interesting variations and do all sorts of things like reharmonize on the fly and come up with interesting arrangements and recognize things by ear. When you recognize one of those idioms, you recognize it. So thanks again, everyone. And we're going to have a final project, which is going to be basically write some music. That's going to be it, but I'll post about that later. Thanks again, everyone, and see you next time.